where to begin with such a blessing of riches here. Neil, why don't I start with you? We've heard from a couple of speakers thus far that renewables are still going strong. Corporates might favor them quietly, maybe not shouting from the rooftops. You're an investor, and you've got experience in this space for many, many years, and you've seen the political wind shift, and you're in touch with both conservatives as well as the liberals, as it were. Where does the money go? What are you seeing as the outlook now for renewables?
Yeah, sure. So long term, I think we have we're in a much better place than I think that the markets are giving us credit for. And the reason is as follows. There's basically a Venn diagram. Now, others have used that phrase, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but there's policy, technology, and markets. So policy is definitely a headwind, but technology and markets are actually tailwinds. And the reason why I think primarily is because the learning rates of wind and solar and other emerging clean technologies are basically so exciting to watch. Solar, most recently, 38% learning rate, which means every doubling of capacity drops cost by 38%. Batteries is 29%. Wind is roughly about 14%. So this kind of environment where technology and markets, basically, if it's cheap, people want it. Now, the policy headwinds are obviously ferocious because hundreds of billions of dollars have been committed in view of all of that policy impetus. So there's a lot of dislocation because people are afraid to invest. But once the ebb subsides and we see the reconciliation bill in its final form, which is emerging, the sausage factory is definitely not pretty. But after that happens and we know what the rules are, I think that the markets are going to regain momentum.
Just to put a sharp point on your argument, and I see obviously the direction of travel of your argument, if the IRA were to be eviscerated on the House version or something close to it, if the Senate doesn't come riding to the rescue and restore tens or hundreds of billions of dollars of benefits that would be enjoyed by renewable investors, and let's say August or September, we have clarity. The lack of clarity goes away. But unfortunately, the clarity is that you ain't getting those subsidies anymore. That's what's clear. Right. Would you still maintain your enthusiastic position about learning curves, about the economics, the technology, or would you say, well, maybe not so much. Maybe those projects don't come back?
Okay, I'm going to try not to say something too controversial here, but
please say something controversial.
But I'm basically in the sausage factory with some of the leading companies that are driving the solar industry, in particular in battery storage. And so just yesterday, I was on a conference call with people that I don't want to mention, and we were basically going through Plan B. Mm-hmm. What happens if the subsidies are gone?
Right.
And there's definitely a cost gap. And so it's going to take some time, but it's not an impossible cost gap to overcome. The most important thing that I think we have to understand about these subsidies in the IRA, the tax credits, is that we're actually catching up. What we need, if the U.S. is really serious and this administration is serious about energy dominance, to ignore the importance of the renewable sector, which is basically double the size in terms of annual capital commitment, is a major mistake. And so from a policy perspective, we need all of the above. We don't want to wait 5 to 8 years for new CCGTs to come online. Renewables are here right now. Let's drive it. So if these subsidies are gone, we're going to see a downshift for a while as the industry has to retool and figure out how to catch up with the falling knife, not get hurt by it, but ultimately figure out how to lower all the costs to be competitive again and profitable.
Great. Okay. So I think that's clear. Thanks for the intel from your investor call. We'll take note of that. Kate, you're spearheading a lot of the interesting work being done in California. California's been a leader in this space, and of course you have your national background as well. The approaches taken by California and Texas are starkly different, and yet both states have a lot of renewables penetration. And people will know in the ERCOT region, as Texas Grid and Management is called, there's much more of a freewheeling market-based approach. California has tended to have more of a long-term planning approach and subsidy support and policy direction and more regulated approach. How do you assess the two approaches, given that they've both produced lots of renewables and battery storage on the grid, the pros and cons, and what can the U.S. learn from the California approach?
Yeah, it's a great question. People love to compare these two states. And one thing I think doesn't get talked about enough is that they're very, very different in terms of land availability, and that makes a big difference in renewables. So Texas has a huge amount of flat, privately owned land that can be leased for renewables. California land is much more contested. We have a lot of mountains. We have a lot of high value agriculture. We have a lot of urban areas. So they look really different. California's got less to work with. And so we have I think partly because of that, a balancing act that we have to do on every piece of land. That said, both states have really powered ahead on particularly large scale renewable generation. One of the things in California that is becoming more and more clear, and I know it's something we're going to talk about on this panel, is that we've invested a huge amount, obviously, in leadership on regulation. That's sort of, we kind of do economic development through regulation. California doesn't have an economic development agency, which is a little known fact about California. So we tend to regulate, and it's driven a lot of innovation and a lot of installation. We have not seen a lot of build out of the supply chains in energy, and there's a huge interest right now in building that up because the state's economy, we saw during COVID, we're seeing now for a lot of other reasons, climate impacts, et cetera, is just not that resilient. We don't have that diversified of an economy. We have innovation, we have installation. We're missing this whole sort of question about where does it make sense for California to really build out these supply chains, to really invest in like moving our lithium from our two major production sites into markets across the supply chain, doing bioeconomy with all of our wood and ag biomass into markets. Where does that make sense? Where is it economic? Because it's not, and I'll end with this, not just about how cheap things are. I think we really have to talk about affordability also. That is the buzzword in California right now. And that's about both how much the thing costs and how able you are to pay for the thing. And how able you are to pay for the thing is about fundamentally, are people making enough money to participate in this economy? And we are seeing serious inequality and serious challenges to that right now. And we just need to build out more, frankly, more parts of the energy economy that provide durable, permanent, long-term jobs and anchor communities and anchor tax bases and just are more of an anchor, frankly, across the state.
Is it fair to say that even in California, which has had a long progressive tradition on environmental issues, going back even to the Air Quality Management District in the South, which is why California early on got the right to set its own environmental standards, right, which is now under threat from the federal government's challenging it, and the Air Resources Board with technology forcing regulations. I mean, the world, it should be noted, benefits from the advances that California brought about in low sulfur fuel, onboard diagnostics, in multiple advances, catalytic converter, for example, right? We all know that. And so these are all things that were hard fought and won, but at the same time also cost some money. And so Californians pay more for energy than the rest of America does typically. That there's a backlash and there's some concern about your ban on ICE engines, for example, internal combustion engines, as well as other areas where you may be slipping on the targets. How should one see that? We see this in Europe as well, where some of the targets on CBAM, the border adjustment mechanism, some of the other rules we'll talk about a bit later in the day, or maybe we'll get to on this panel. But nevertheless, that there is a bit of slippage and maybe a loosening of the belt on some of these things because of concerns about cost and competitiveness. How do you calibrate that?
I mean, I think you laid them out, so I don't have to, but I think these regulations have been incredibly important. You know, our cap and trade system, our renewable portfolio system, all of the commitments have driven markets. But I do think California, and this is applicable, I think, across the world, has made a mistake in having emissions as the one metric by which we evaluate climate leadership. If emissions is your one metric, first of all, it kind of forces jurisdictions into this artificial idea that carbon emissions are locally constrained, that they're local pollutants. They're not. And you make weird decisions. Like we right now in California, if you have a closed oil refinery and you want to put a battery manufacturing plant on that site, you're actually increasing emissions under the current modeling, right? Because you have nothing and you're going to something, that's an increase. I really think we all need to be more thoughtful about expanding the metrics to include national security, energy security, resilience of the overall system, resilience in the face of climate impacts and geopolitical impacts, if we don't start expanding our definitions, I think both we're going to get caught up in this regulatory only system, which are, you could unwind that. It puts a target on the back of a thing. And second, I just don't think it's durable from a policy perspective or an economic development perspective if we don't start expanding that.
That's a big idea. I don't think we'll be able to unpack it completely on this stage, but you just put your finger on something that is at the heart of the entire big climate project globally, which is emissions and emissions targets. That's the basis of the Paris Accord. When you talk about net zero, what is it? Zero is emissions, right? And so if you say, let's pull on that thread, good luck to you. I'd like to see what you come up with.
That's what we're trying to do.
Also bear in mind, it's a can of worms. So let's see what you come up with on round 2 of that. Vanessa, let's come to you. You and I have had lots of interesting conversations when you were at the DOE, spearheading the commercialization efforts. And now you're working on interesting projects in academia at Penn. Can you tell us on this critical challenge that clean energy technologies tend to have, right? This is different from software and SaaS companies where 2 guys in a garage can throw up a soft launch and, be $1 billion valuation in a month or 2. This is stuff you need to drop, you need to build. It can cost $100 million to get to N of 1 or 2 or more for energy projects. And so, what did you learn from the time you're in government, and what do you think we need to do better, or what are you hoping we'll do better? Even to get to abundance and domination, you still have to scale up, right? So at least that might be one place where we can find common ground in this country. What should we be doing better?
Well, first of all, I love commercialization of hard technologies because it's hard, and I find that very fun. But I think the first question you want to ask is, who wants to pay more for anything? Like, nobody ever raises their hand. And so when we were at DOE, we were very focused on thinking about, for these clean energy technologies, how do you get to a point where you are able to get to what we called commercial liftoff, where the private sector could actually be bringing these technologies to market, deploying them, and making money, and that consumers were willing to pay for it at a price that was affordable. So that has always been the focus. And when Bill and IRA were passed, we had close to $500 billion from DOE to deploy towards clean energy, which seems like a lot of money, but it's nothing compared to the $23 trillion that the private sector has. So the question was, how do we actually use the $500 billion to activate the $23 trillion? So in the end, it's the private sector that commercializes. And that's when these pathways to commercial liftoff were the commercialization roadmaps and the foundation of the industrial strategy that we put together on how we actually activate the entire ecosystem to go do this. We wrote it with the private sector. So after we had done all this, one of the things that really was a head scratch to me is, how do we actually finance this? Many people say China stole solar from us. And I would disagree with that, because what happened was China was willing to invest when it wasn't profitable. And in order to actually drive costs down, you actually have to invest to get down the cost curve. So it's kind of like saying, I want to be an Olympic athlete, but I don't want to train. But I invented the sport, so therefore I should be an Olympic athlete. That's not how the Olympic works. I would love it if that was the case. I would invent something and get a gold medal. You have to train. And we don't want to train because we just want to win. So the question becomes, how do we think more creatively around risk and financing? And so right now I am leading an effort together with Clean Energy Ventures, thinking about that balance. Because in the end, we have a Squid Game situation right now, where everyone is first in line to be 9th or 10th. They are not first in line to be first or second, because the person who's first or second loses money. And guess what? We're in a capitalistic society where we all want to make money, which is wonderful. We all want to win the Olympics, but who's going to do the training? So I think there's a need to think more expansively, instead of like investing on the first of a kind, second of a kind. How do we invest in 10 of a kind as an ecosystem? How do we think about the role that the private sector plays? Are they willing to take a lower return on invested capital as we're learning? Are we able to get philanthropy to play a role? Can we do things where the government maybe is able to help subsidize some of that risk? Can we have insurance companies think differently about how do they actually help on the backside of insurance? Are there insurance products that are backed by the federal government? Are there roles that the states can play? Are there things that EPCs can do where they're willing to take a hit because they know on the other side, if we figure out how to actually manufacture SMRs, they have a lot of money on the other side to make. So really kind of what I'm trying to figure out right now is, how do we in a capitalistic society rethink risk and rethink financing and rethink how we share it across an ecosystem to get to the tipping point where the unit economics work. And the current way in which investors and others, no offense, think is not going to get us there because the technology isn't there yet from a cost perspective. So we have to think very creatively. So kind of my ask is I think anytime you're on a stage like this, there's an ask. If any of you want to think more creatively and are willing to not think about the capitalistic way and just wait to win the Olympics, then please come find us because we're really looking hard to have out-of-the-box thinkers who are willing to push and pull on that risk versus financing trade-offs and how do we do more collectively so that America can be abundant in energy in a cost-effective way.
Great. Thank you. And I'll obviously follow up with her on that. You put forward 3 or 4 specific ideas, some form of aggregation or advanced market commitment, right? We saw Google do this with its SMR deal with, I think it's with Kairos, if I'm not mistaken. One of the new companies will buy 6 because they know the first one will be so expensive. The 6th one, they hope, should be a more reasonable price. They'll take the average price. There are other mechanisms that you also identified, but the basic problem, when I talk to companies, private equity players who say they're doing this, actually, they haven't fundamentally changed their model, and therefore very few deals are getting done.
Yes.
They're still applying the same analysis, the same kind of metrics.
Exactly.
Their funds are the same duration that they were before. They're not extending their duration to allow a longer runway for hard tech, which sometimes takes more than 3 to 5 years. It might take 10 or 20. And so I'm wondering, I guess I wish you luck. I'd love to see American capitalism or Wall Street capitalism reinvented. I'd like to know how you're going to do it or who you're working with. It might have to take some of that philanthropic capital or government.
I'm very analytically driven as an engineer, and we can figure this out through Monte Carlo simulations. Yeah. All I need is for people to actually be willing to take a little bit of a hit earlier on, and then we can get there.
Okay. All right. Like I say, I think it's extremely important. There may need to be other kinds of models of risk sharing, or even, we've seen the prize or incentive model. There was a time, some of you will remember your history, the Longitude Prize, one of the most famous prizes offered. In that case, it was the British Parliament offered, and it was won by a clockmaker who figured out how ships can reckon longitude on the high seas. And like that, there was a great era of prizes that were offered. The Advanced Market Commitments on Neglected Diseases for the Developing World was a pharmaceutical prize that allowed sometimes 10 or 50x the amount of investment that would normally come into a new area comes people pursuing a prize. So there are novel ways of doing things we've done in the past. Maybe we'll return to some of those, and risk sharing it with new ways and new coalitions could be one of them. I want to turn to Andrew. Andrew, you look after high power charging, which I presume doesn't mean you're a skyrocketing executive, although surely you are, that it has something to do with EVs that can recharge very quickly. Tell me, this is an odd time to be in America with that title. It seems to me we are low power charging, and if anything, charging down on our EV markets, given recent developments in Washington. Tell me why that's not so. What's the reason for optimism and why America will hopefully continue down the road of high power charging?
So I want to pull on a couple of strings, and maybe one from Neil first, which he mentioned technology as a tailwind. And I think about where we are in the automotive industry and maybe reframing the narrative, which is not of electric vehicles, but of innovation. And if you think about the first principles around what we're building, electric vehicles are better products, better technology in terms of power and performance, in terms of digitization, in terms of meeting the lifestyle needs of the driver today, thinking about consumer choice. I want to maybe pull on something Vanessa said, which is we're looking at where we are in the marketplace and some of the fundamental challenges that we're still facing, namely around cost, namely around quality as we scale and sort of go through the iterations of learning. With Mercedes-Benz, we've known automotive for some time. We've been in the industry for 130 years, and we're looking at the future and where we need to invest in this, challenging time to really get through some of these, cost or infrastructure problems that allow us to have electric vehicles at full adoption. So that's what Mercedes-Benz high power charging is. It's our $1 billion commitment to build a open access charging network and really solve some of these fundamental challenges within the industry, which to date, it's been reliability. So that's what we're focused on, really hoping that we can deliver a charging infrastructure and a charging network that delivers, successful critical infrastructure where people need it when they need it. Beyond that, though, our kind of thesis here is that there is a behavioral shift happening as we make this transition around clean energy, around renewables. It's not just about getting our power from utilities. It's about generating power at home. It's not just a engine block with four wheels. It's really a lifestyle kind of digital platform, which is our car in the future. And our thesis around this is to support what people do while they charge. So really thinking about lowering the time and the inconvenience factor related to the infrastructure we're building as well.
That's great. That's super interesting. What you just got to, the point you landed on, relates to vehicle to grid, multi-directional charging and flows of energy. In the most recent Economist, I've written a piece that's created a little bit of a stir amongst people that follow this very obscure topic, which is demand response, may finally be getting the attention. As you know, the energy world has a drill, baby, drill, build, baby, build bias, a supply-side bias. And often neglected is the fact that there are tremendous possibilities in looking at demand response. But as we move towards a world of more micro power, micro generators, and the enormous amount of energy potential in EVs over time, which will, like most cars, lie fallow most of the time, right? Most internal combustion engine cars are hardly used 2 to 3% of the time. They sit in your driveway, then they sit at the parking garage at work. And so, but with this new capability, which you're building in and others, we'll have the potential to harness them and maybe time shift, maybe serve the grid at peak and help save California from a blackout, the duck curve you folks have infamously. And so those are the great potentials that are now coming. The question for you is this. You ducked my question about America, maybe wisely on your part, not wanting to opine what's going to happen here. But what about China? There's some mention of China earlier. BYD's talked about extremely rapid chargings. Other competitors in China as well are advancing. We know, they're clearly in the lead, and that something like 60% of new cars sold this year in China are likely to be EVs, if not higher. Do you think they have an insurmountable lead, or do you believe that there may be some advantages that European companies like yours have as well?
Yeah, I mean, I look to, there was a recent article out, and they framed China as the first electro state, compared to the petrol states of, the 1970s. And we know what happened when there was, a global crisis around petrol. The U.S. was in trouble. And I think about where we are today with China between now and 2040, going from really about 3 terawatts to 8 terawatts of power production. And on the EV side, last year they sold 40% of new cars being electric. We're at 10%. And actually within Q2, that number is coming down a little bit in terms of trend line. So, again, back to what Vanessa said, we need to continue to invest where we are now in solving some of these fundamental challenges around affordability, around infrastructure in order to get there. That said, I think back to 2010, which was really kind of the birth of the electric vehicle industry, and it was America that led that innovation. It was Tesla before people knew how to spell EV. It was Tesla that innovated around this technology. So can we do it? Yes. Do we need to continue to invest? Yes.
It's funny you mentioned Tesla. I met Elon Musk about 17 years ago, back during the early days. And around that time, there was a competitor, Heinrich Fisker. Some of you will know. Fisker was a hot, European-inspired alternative to Teslas. And it was very unclear early on which one would do well. I liked the Fisker. It was great. But, there was something different about this guy, Elon, I wrote at the time in The Economist. Of course, Fisker went bust. Despite the Tesla death watch, Tesla survived. Fisker came back. Some of you will know. How many of you maybe heard about the Fisker a couple of years ago? Did anybody put a deposit on it? Hands up. Anyone try to buy it? Guess what? My hand is still up. Because I did. I put down a deposit to buy a Fisker. It looked beautiful. Fisker Ocean. I was so excited. And before I could get my car, the company went bankrupt the second time. And this morning, when I called for my Uber, a Fisker Ocean turned up.
Wow.
I had never seen one in real life. I'm like, what is this? It was just the most beautiful car I've ever seen. Solar panels embedded in the sky, the skylight, as it were. And the driver was so happy. He gets 325 miles per charge, he tells me. It was extraordinary, right? Beautiful. But again, the company is bankrupt. So if anything goes wrong, I don't know who's going to take care of his car, but he's super happy with the car. I've lost my shirt twice now with Fisker. So the question of, these cycles come and go in America, is this another false dawn in America? I have to put you on the spot for EVs. What's your sense?
So I go back to, and I'll, use Gina McCarthy's, quote of, it's not politics, it's people. And I go back to the people. And in order to understand our product, we need to go out to the market and drive. So I was on a recent road trip in Texas, and I was charging, and I always do mystery shopping, and I introduced myself to a gentleman who was with his daughter who was driving a Chevy Silverado EV. And I asked him what his experience was, and he said he had rented it to drop his daughter off at school. And he said that it was his first EV experience. He said he had never thought that the technology could be this good. And he said that, he had brought this vehicle to his job site, which is actually an oil jack in Texas, and how everybody made fun of him, did not, sort of see this, car as, supportive of their lifestyles. And he brought his crew for a drive. And after that drive, everybody was an evangelist. Everybody was sold. So I don't think that we're in a downward cycle for electric vehicles. I think there's a lot of education that we still need to do. And I still think there are fundamental challenges that we need to solve. But I do think, again, back to kind of reframing the narrative, it's about innovation. And this is an innovation towards better technology in the automotive industry.
Great. Okay, good. I hope springs eternal. Maybe son of Fisker will come back in a few years and I'll put some money down on his car. Great, Alex, let's come to you. Alex, you've heard our, pioneers, those, they're at the bleeding edge of this, trying to make it happen. Now, you're an analyst of this area, and you have deep visibility into companies doing it, but you step back from the fray. Give us your, sort of your wise perspective from the ivory tower here. The economics of renewables, I hear conflicting things, right? We know that solar is the cheapest way to make electricity around the world, according to the IEA. Almost everywhere, even cheaper than new coal, and maybe even cheaper than established coal in a number of countries, because of the collapse in prices, the learning curves that were alluded to and when solar plus batteries, you're able to firm them. The battery costs have advanced in the last 5 years, even more aggressively downward than it took, what took 15 years for solar to accomplish. But at the same time, we also have a challenge with solar, the supply chain challenges. It's capex heavy, opex light. That means you're interest rate vulnerable, right? And supply chain inflation and interest rates are a killer combo. When you get to gigawatt scale, you start big numbers again. You may be reliant on balance of plant. It's not just the cost of the panel you need to install, and the U.S. has very high installation costs where we haven't figured out how to, commoditize that. So can you give us an idea? What is the right way to think about benchmarking? And of course, solar is not firm unless you add the batteries and account for maybe a bit of gas, that some people do. So what's the real cost advantage, if there is one, for the most attractive renewables package in a world where we are going to value reliability and affordability, not just green?
Yeah, Vijay, no, spot on that. And look, I share much of the optimism here in the long run around the role of wind, solar, battery storage, EVs. There is a real fundamental technology advantage to this. There is a cost advantage in the long run. I would say where I'm spending a lot of time with my clients, though, is understanding what the short-term to medium-term, next 5 years looks like, and what some of the challenges are around that. And I think that's really where, yes, there are fantastic technology headwinds. I think Neil well said, right? Technology markets and policy, you need all of that. But the degree to which there are policy headwinds and increasingly market headwinds that we've already seen manifesting in the form of higher supply chain costs, more challenging geopolitical environments to manage, of course, a higher cost of capital, that is really shifting the economics in the near term. And, if we
is it killing the economics, or?
No, it's not killing the economics at all. Fundamentally, in the U.S., we have significant demand, load growth, of course, forthcoming. And there is a relative advantage in certain market segments for EVs today, where it's already beating out ICE, setting aside subsidies on all of that. I think what is happening, though, is we're pushing out the degree to which the gap widens or expands to different market segments. And so that's creating a more uncertain, more risky environment layered on top of all of this larger geopolitical and political policy risk in the U.S. overall. And so that will make investment harder in the near term. It's not just the return that's challenged, it's always a risk-adjusted return, right? And when risk is going up, it's harder for investors to pull the trigger on that capital. But I think the most important thing, of course, is to watch the budget reconciliation package. And on that side, if we see an elimination of the ITC, PTC, in the near term, as well as the EV subsidies, that could drive a real material cost increase overall that will ultimately be passed through to markets, because exactly as many have said, we need renewables and battery storage in the near term to meet the load growth. The market is there. What's going to happen is the market will have to bear a higher price in the short term.
So you obviously at BCG have a lot of Fortune 100 customers. Some of the big tech companies will surely be known to you. We have seen the market for renewables in the U.S. driven by the PPAs. That particularly the Silicon Valley and big tech companies were early to sign. Really, the market was made possible because of their willingness to sign these contracts and provide certainty to investors on the back end and banks. Are they getting skittish, they and other corporates, or are you finding that they're going to likely to stick with it because of their green commitments, or maybe because they're familiar with it? This is part of what they've committed to, and if in fact there is any kind of reconsideration because of the likely cost increases, what's the alternative? You can't get a nuclear plant for 5 to 10 years. You can't get a GE Vernova turbine for 4 or 5 years. That's what they tell me, and Siemens is about the same. And so, where do they get their power?
Yeah, no, it's not changing at all. I mean, there's just the incredible need for power and from any source that's possible, right? And I think they've had to bear higher PPA prices. We've seen PPA prices increasing for a couple of years now, driven by inflationary pressures, higher cost of capital. I think that could increase further given tariff implications. We'll see where things ultimately land, but we know renewables and battery storage are more exposed to tariffs than, say, gas power generation. But it's really, we talked about an all of the above strategy. I think the tech companies are deploying that strategy, right? Anything and everything they can get anywhere. And we're seeing with that all sorts of really more novel types of commercial structures come to play here. Something like, I don't know if it's not gotten a whole lot of attention, but the Entergy Meta deal in Louisiana, where there's renewables, there's gas power generation, there's even gas with carbon capture and storage in that portfolio overall to mitigate the GHG impact of the unabated gas coming on. So from our perspective, I think there's a lot of that in the works, and we're going to see a lot more novel types of and much broader PPA type structures incorporating a wider range of technologies.
One particularly geeky question. There's a bit of a buzz amongst those who follow this because the standard measure for comparing all these technologies on competitiveness, the thing we're talking about here, is levelized cost of energy. And Lazard does an annual analysis that's widely reviewed, and people kind of use it to say this is what is cheaper. There's a pushback suggesting that's not an appropriate way to measure this, or it's inadequate measure. Just in simple layman's terms, for those who are not financial nerds in the audience, should we still look at levelized cost of energy as the standard benchmark, or do you also have issues with it?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a reason.
Which one?
It's become we should keep
it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a reason it's become so common and such a powerful metric to compare. Now, is it perfect? Does it capture every market circumstance? No. What I'd argue as a consultant is we just need more metrics, more ways to understand the specific needs, right? If you're interested in the relative cost of firming resource, well, you can look at a metric relative to that. But at the end of the day, I think it's a bit of a red herring, the argument that's pulled out all the time that says, well, LCOE doesn't really capture all the firming, all that. But, well, for 80%, 60 to 80% of the time it does capture it, that's a pretty good metric for a majority of the market. Just add other metrics to understand.
VJ, can I
Yeah, jump in. And I want to let the audience know, I'm going to come to you in a minute, so please get 1 or 2 questions for our gurus. Go ahead.
One thing I want to talk about in the near term is grid enhancing technologies. And the reason why is because it's like reconductoring, like the existing wires we have are really old technology, dynamic line rating and all that. And we had done a liftoff report showing that if we were to do grid enhancing technologies across the nation, we could increase the existing capacity of our grid by 30%.
It was astonishing, actually. So astonishing that I wrote it up in The Economist.
Right, but we're not doing it. And the reason, and this is one of the, when you ask about the near term, what can we do? We should be deploying GETs. And there's less than a 1-year payback. So you scratch your head and say, why are we not doing this? We're not doing this because the way in which utilities are incented is on return on invested capital, another metric. And the way in which rates are set is such that if a utility were to deploy GETs, they actually can't be compensated for the additional capacity they're putting on. So there's things like that we have to think out of the box. Can we change that? Because if we don't change it and we're using these old metrics and old ways of doing business, we're actually missing opportunities for proven technologies that work, that have less than a 1-year payback, and we can't actually get it out the door.
I just spoke with the head of one of the biggest utilities in America, who I asked about these grid-enhancing technologies, and he said, yes, we do use them. Do they work? Yes, we're finding that they're working. Are you going to massively roll them out? No. And I said, well, we're keeping an eye on them. We're looking at them. It's like, well, what's the issue? There was no issue, but there was no incentive. There's no motivation to do it. Despite the fact that load growth is going to increase, they can't get permissions for new, transmission, all the things why, as you rightly point out, no particular motivation to roll them out. Let me see if we have a quick question. Okay, there's a quick hand here. Let's get a microphone to the lady. Please identify yourself, as always.
My name is Catherine Poirier. I'm the Director of Food Security and Sustainability at Western New Mexico University. Thank you for having me here today. My question, which I've written down, is how can or what is some of the language or messaging, whether internal or external, of reliability legacy that Mercedes has that may assist with revising some of the lens that Vanessa had spoke about around risk and finance?
Wow, very specific question for you.
Yeah, I think earlier someone had talked about, the California mandate, and I think, that is a politicized word, the mandate to buy electric vehicles. As we move forward, one of the, changes to our language specifically has been around consumer choice. And again, letting the technology and the product drive consumer choice. So we say, pick your powertrain. I think in the past, people have designed electric vehicles to look different, to be different. Going forward, what you'll see in the industry, not just from Mercedes-Benz, but by pretty much everybody, is it will be a great car that people know how to use with a different powertrain and drivetrain within it. So I think, a great example of that, other than Mercedes, would be the Ford F-150 Lightning. If you've ever experienced that vehicle, it is a Ford F-150 with an electric motor in it. It is very similar. So that's how we're kind of changing the narrative and language around EV adoption.
America's best-selling vehicle, right? The F-150. Yep. There's a microphone there. Please go ahead, sir.
Hi, my name is William Tyson from Schneider Electric. This has been a great panel. My question is about more towards Vanessa and maybe Kate on voluntary carbon markets and carbon markets in general. Vanessa, you kind of talked about the training ground, right? And carbon markets were supposed to serve as that training ground to get projects up and running. And we've seen it with carbon capture and storage, which was mentioned. There's a lot of focus on removals. And also China really leveraged it for renewable energy in the voluntary carbon market in the early days. And also with Kate, in California with your carbon market there, how do you see carbon markets serving as that training ground going forward to kind of spur further innovation in renewable energy and outside?
Thank you. And Kate, since he's brought it up, I hear the carbon markets are falling apart in California, so maybe you can tell us about there too.
Well, we're in the middle of a negotiation on our cap and trade system. As folks probably know, it is set to expire in 2030, and we were on a path to try to figure out a smarter, I think, reauthorization, and then that got vastly accelerated because the president attacked it in an executive order, and so our governor essentially told us we have to figure out how to reauthorize it now. So very active conversation. I do think that the carbon markets are really important. Look, I mean, there's no question that our system in California, and this is why I'm saying we still need emissions as a metric. It just shouldn't be the only one. Our system in California really did create a market. It created a market for avoided emissions that created a lot of innovation. That's really, really important. I worry a lot about voluntary markets because they're so mercurial, right? Right now the carbon removal market is mostly created by Stripe and a bunch of companies buying carbon removal credits. They don't have to do that. That's all entirely voluntary. And so it's a very tenuous market. One thing we're thinking about a lot in California is, could you start treating a ton of removed carbon like a ton of avoided carbon and actually create a real market, a regulated market for removal, which is much more verifiable and measurable than it used to be and is very tangible. You're actually removing something in a durable way from the existing system. Super, super important, particularly because you have actual impact on climate disasters if you do that. So we are thinking a lot about it, but the voluntary market thing has always worried me because at the end of the day, these companies we've all talked about this all day. These companies have a bottom line that they're trying to reach. And, if you back out of a voluntary market, it sort of falls apart.
Yeah.
And
30-second answer.
Yeah, one thing
We're
I
out
would
of time.
say is actually flip it into carbon tariffs, which is Eli Sandler from Harvard just published a paper showing that because we produce in such a green way, if you do a carbon tariff, we actually are ahead in the U.S. And so I think there's other ways to think about voluntary and flipping it to be advantageous to the U.S.
And just carbon accounting in general, like different ways of carbon accounting. I think that's great.
Well, great. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that, we have long advocated to the economists some form of carbon pricing. Externalities really help explain a big part of what the world gets wrong in responding to climate change. You can't use the word tax in America. And even the UN climate envoy, who's now Prime Minister of Canada, his first action was to abolish the carbon tax, at least part of it. So bear in mind, you can't call it a tax, but if we think about honest pricing, we would be much more insightful and innovative in pursuing some of these policies. Let's hope California can lead the way. Please join me in thanking our dream team of panelists here. Thank you. Appreciate it. Good to see you. Thanks, Vanessa.